It was a hot summer morning in 1805. Two women and a little girl were walking through the valley. They were Shoshone Indians. Suddenly, they saw something strange and frightening. It was a group of odd-looking men walking toward them. The men had plaid skin, hair growths on their face. One woman ran and hid. The other woman and the little girl were so terrified that they could not move. The strange man came closer and closer. One reached into the bag he carried at his side. The little girl bent her head and closed her eyes in fear, but nothing happened. She opened her eyes. The man was holding out a necklace of beads. It was for her. Then he leaned down and rubbed the bright red paint on her cheeks. The little girl knew what that meant. It was a Shoshone sign for peace. The woman who had run away came back. She too got bleeds. Her cheeks were also painted red by this old bad gentleman. The three Shoshones led the stranger into their camp. One way 60 Shoshone warriors rode up on horseback. When they saw the signs of peace and the gifts, they welcomed the explorer. The leader of the stranger was a man named Meriwether Lewis. He needed to talk with Shoshones. He and his men needed help to go on with the long journey they were making, but they could not speak the Shoshone languages, and the Shoshones could not speak their languages, English. But Meriwether Lewis knew that in a few days the rest of his men could catch up with his smaller group. Lewis' partner, William Clark, was leading the others. With Clark, there was a young woman who could speak the Shoshone languages. Her name is Sacagawea. Before Clark and the other arrived, Lewis and the Shoshones could use only sign languages. It was not easy to talk this way, and not much could be said. Lewis was able to say that he and his men were friendly, but he could not explain what they were doing in this wide land. He could not explain why their trip was so important. It's hard now to imagine what the United States was like in 1805. Part of it, the eastern half, had farms and towns and cities, but half of it was a monster, completely unknown. West of the Mississippi River, there were no towns. The few maps that there were showed very little. No one knew what the land was really like or who lived there. There were many different Indian tribal across a huge area west of the Mississippi. Each tribal tribe knew the area it lived in and some of the nearby land, but no one had ever crossed the whole unknown territory. This wide land just been bought from France 2 years before. It was called Louisiana. The Louisiana Territory was much larger than the state of Louisiana is today. It included all of the land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. Mountains. At that time, Thomas Jefferson was the President of the United States. President Jefferson wanted to find out what the Louisiana Territory was like. He knew there were rivers, he knew there were mountains, but he didn't know exactly what the rivers went. He didn't know how to get across the mountains. He didn't know what the plants or the animals or the people were like. Thomas Jefferson sent Meri- Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to find out. Lewis and Clark prepared well for their journey. They bought boats, medicines, tools, flour, and sleds. They bought gifts for the Indians. They knew they would meet. They bought paper and inks for maps and reports. On May 15, 14, 1804, Lewis and Clark, 43 other men began their trip from St. Louis, Missouri. By November, the group of explorers had gone as far as the middle of what is now North Dakota. There they stopped for their winter. The next part of their trip would be very hard. They would have to travel a long way to the Rocky Mountains. President Jefferson wanted them to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. To do that, they would have to cross the mountains, and they couldn't cross the mountain without horse. Shoshone Indians lived near the Rocky Mountains, and they had horses, but Lewis and Clark had no way to talk with the Shoshones. They needed someone who could speak the Shoshone languages. They found a white man named Tosigans and Charbonneau. He could speak the language used by several tribes. They could not speak Shoshone, but he had a young Indian wife who could. Her name was Sacagawea. He meant a birdman. Neither Meriwether Lewis nor William Clark liked Carbonier. He was not a very likable man, but they agreed to hire him if he would bring Scarecrow along. When the explorers set out in the spring, Carbon knew and Scarecrow went too. A third, third new person also joined the group. He was Jean Baptiste Carbonell, Skagawi's baby son. Although Skagawi was only about 17 years old, she did not behave like a girl. She seemed older than her years. Perhaps it was because her childhood had been cut short. Skagawi could speak the Shoshone language because she was a Shoshone Indian herself. She had been born in what is now Idaho, when she was about 11. Her people had been attacked by the group of Hidasti Indians. As Skagawi ran across the river, she was caught and carried away by enemy warriors on horseback. The young girl was taken far from her family to live with Hidatsis. Several years later, Charbonneau won her in a bed with the Hidata chief. Skagari became his wife. Now she was on her way home, back to the land where she had lived with her own people. By the end of July, the explorers were in what is now western Montana. Scotty recognized the land. She told Lewis and Clark that they were not far from her people, the Shoshones. The group was traveling in boats. Lewis was in a hurry to meet the Shoshones, and the boats were slow. He decided to go ahead on foot with a small group to look for the Indians. A few days later, Clark was walking behind Skagawi. Suddenly, he saw her begin to dance with joy. She had seen Meriwether Lewis and the Shoshones. Sacagawea was overjoyed to find several of her childhood friends. One was a young woman who had been captured when Sacagawea was. She had escaped from the Hidatsa and had found her way home. Now, now the two were together again. At last, the explorer and the Shoshones would be able to talk with each other. He, they sat in a circle in the shade of some willow trees. They passed a peace, peace people smoking the pipe was a sign of friendship. The Shoshones took off their moccasins. Lewis and Clark had learned what this meant, so they took their boats off too. The meant that any promise made would be kept. Or whoever broke promise would walk barefoot forever. Skagawi came to sit down with the men. She looked across the circle and saw the chief for the first time since she had arrived. To Lewis and Clark's surprise, she ran to him and threw her arms around him. The chief was her brother. Skagawi was able to help the explorer expand their trip. There was no Shoshone word for Princeton, so Skagawi called Thomas Jefferson the Great Father. The Shoshone did not know what the Palace Ocean was, at least by that name, so she said that they wanted to go all the way to the big water. The Shoshones agreed to sell the horse the explorers needed. They also promised to send among several guides to show them the way across the Rocky Mountains. When Lewis and Clark left to continue their journey, Skagawi went with them, even though her most important job was over. There were many ways she could help. Skagawi could point out the best way to go whenever they were passing through land she recognized. She could find roots and berries that were safe and good to eat. The Lewis and Clark expedition was a great success. Lewis and Clark and their men made safely back to St. Louis in September 800, 1806. More had been learned about America's western lands than had ever been known before. Settlers began to travel to their frontier territory. Towns grew when there had been only trees and deer. Railroads were built where there had been only Indians paths. The expedition might never had success without Skagawi. For all her valuable help, she got a silver medal, but she got something else as well. She got a feeling about herself. For all her long life, Skagawi knew that she had made a difference. She knew that she had done what needed to be done, and done it well.